The legs are a little toasted after yesterday's race. I'm out for a nice easy spin, but they are definitely feeling it. In terms of racing, France is definitely the place I feel most at home. It's the place I've raced the most in the last few years, and it's also the style of racing that I like the most. It's just incredibly aggressive. And that crazy aggression makes the racing so fun because there's always something happening, there's always something on the go, there's always the chance that you'll get into a group and bridge up to the front. There's never a sort of steady, relaxed moment where things are predictable. It's also the reason why I think France has the highest standard of non-pro racing in the world. The guys are incredibly strong, they're incredibly motivated, they are super aggressive, and it just makes for such good positive racing. The race is just never over. There's always someone who's missed out, someone who's trying to get a group to go. There's always something happening. So that's why I really love racing here, because it's positive, it's fast, and it's just such good fun. I'm gonna head home down the hill and then we can dig into some power data from the race in Saint Amour. I had a quick haircut and got rid of the mop. I hate having my haircut in France because you're like trapped there and you have to talk to the people who are cutting your hair in French, and then it's like this interrogation of why you're not French. So let's dig into the power data from the Prix de Saint Amour. So the race was 112 kilometers, which we covered in 2 hours and 40 minutes, which gave us an average speed of just around 42 kilometers an hour, which pretty solid on that kind of course. When you dig into the actual power data, I had an average power of 280 watts and I had a normalized power of 329 or 330 watts for the 2 hours and 40 minutes. Looking back through the power data of my races this season, it's actually the toughest race I've done in terms of normalized power. When you put the normalized power aside and start to dig into the actual peak wattages from the race, it suddenly looks a little different. None of the numbers are that high actually. I had a 5-second peak of 1046 watts. I had a 30-second peak of 653 watts, a 1-minute peak of 549 watts, 4-minute peak of 394 watts, and a 5-minute peak of 390 watts. None of those power numbers are particularly impressive. They're not even that close to what my personal maxes are or what I've done in other races. So it's difficult to see why with those numbers the race was actually so hard. From my perspective, there are two things that make a race hard. You have races which are hard all day, but never really require a maximal effort for any decent period of time. Then on the flip side, you have races which are much steadier and usually longer, but often require a maximal effort or multiple maximal efforts for extended periods of time. The pro races and a lot of climbing races tend to be like this, where you have a much steadier pace, but then there are a few pivotal moments during the race where you're forced to go to your maximum. The Saint Amour race was definitely the first kind of hard. It never required a maximal effort, maybe beyond 5 seconds or 10 seconds, but it was consistently hard all day because we were doing repetitions of these short efforts and big accelerations and things like that. So it never required 2 minutes flat out, or even 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes of all out effort. It was always just these small moments that came around really regularly. When you start to look at the actual circuit and the race conditions and the team tactics, the power data starts to make a lot more sense. The race circuit was 3.2 kilometers, with the major challenge being a 700 meter climb at 4%. The gradient on the climb was super variable. We had some sections at 2%, some sections at 10%, so it really wasn't a steady 4% grade the entire way up. Once you crested the climb, there was also this really tight left-hand corner, which was basically so tight that there was only space for one rider at a time. So what you had was a lot of congestion, where if you weren't in the first 5-6 riders, you really pretty much had to slam on brakes and cruise in really, really slowly. And if you were further back than that, you were often pretty much stopped, just waiting to have your turn to go through the corner. So since the bunch strung out so much through this corner, you were pretty much required to do a maximal sprint out of the corner every time to get your speed up and to get onto the wheel in front of you, and then to catch the riders who had gone through at a much higher speed. That was also a really tough part of the course, which required a short and really hard sprint just to catch the guys who had been better positioned than you were. But once you were back on the wheels and the road started to trend downhill, it was pretty easy to close that gap and for the peloton to actually form a group again instead of just one long line. Secondly was the conditions on race day. We had a tailwind down the descent before turning left, and we had a headwind on the longest stretch of the course leading back to the climb. Into that headwind, the race really slowed down. There was a lot less attacking. There was more riders wanting to hide on the wheels and less people sort of willing to work with you if you did get a bit of a gap. So really what you had was a section of the course which was kind of neutralized almost because of the wind, and then you had one section which was incredibly aggressive. The final piece of the puzzle was tactics. Everyone tends to usually favor attacking on a climb because it requires everyone else to put out similar or very similar efforts in order to stay with you. So when you attack on a climb and you burn a match, it means that everyone else has to burn a match to stay with you. Whereas if you attack on the flat, although it's less predictable, people can get an easier ride if they're straight on your wheel and they sort of need to use less energy. Even though there was a group of 3 up the road and there were a couple teams in the peloton who had missed that break, there was no team that sort of rolled onto the front and chased and slowly pegged the gap back and brought it back together. Instead, what teams prefer to do is to attack. And by attacking, they keep the pace high and they keep the race going. But if they do get a rider away, then they have a chase group which they are represented in, which can then bridge up to the front. So we had an incredibly fast tempo on the climb, and there was a lot of attacking, and we really flew up there. But the rest of the circuit was raced a lot slower. So the break of 3 survived a really, really long time without getting too much of a gap. But we never closed it either, because we would close it down a lot on the hill, but then the rest of the circuit, they would get their gap back again. And all they had to do was ride steady and work together and share the workload. And the gap remained relatively constant for a long time. The only real reason we actually caught the break in the end was that people started to get a bit desperate and a bit frantic and started to attack and keep the pace really high on the flat section of the course as well. So instead of just eating into the advantage on the hill, we were also keeping it constant or bringing them back on the flat section of road as well. And that made the difference in the end, which allowed it to come back together for a bunch sprint. So when you look at it as a whole, the power data starts to make a lot more sense. What you have is a race with a lot of surges, but then also a decent amount of time of doing nothing. So at the base of the climb, you had to accelerate and surge in order to keep your position in the group and not be swamped by riders from behind. So that required an acceleration. On the climb, you had to put out decent power in order to stay with the group and hold your position. And then as you got to the summit of the hill and maybe had to wait a little bit for the corner, you then had to sprint really hard out of the left-hand corner and close the gap back to the peloton and get on the wheels. And once you were back in the group and things started to compress, it really slowed down. So that effort was only maybe 90 seconds every lap. So there was a really tough 90 seconds sometimes it wasn't that hard, but it was never a sustained 5 minutes of hard effort or 10 minutes or 15 minutes or anything like that. So while there were no big peak power numbers, there was a lot of accelerations, and it basically just turned into kind of an interval session where you would sprint up the climb, sprint out of the corner, and then relax and recover the rest of the circuit before doing it again. So within the race, I made 20 efforts of between 5 and 15 seconds over 750 watts. The majority of those were coming out of the corner at the top of the climb or attacking on the climb. I also made 5 efforts over 1,000 watts, which was usually coming out of that corner at the top when I wasn't so well placed and really had to accelerate hard. So power data always needs to be looked at in the context of the race, because that's the only place it really makes sense. That's the only way that race could be explained. And if you looked at the power data from the breakaway, it would look very different to the power that I put out. I had someone ask me down in the YouTube comments how it's possible for some people to not really put out good power, but to do well in a relatively big race, like a Pro 1-2 or something. My race in Saint Amour was kind of like that, because it was a really hard race, but analyzing the actual power data, it was nothing impressive at all. there are a few ways that you can actually do well without putting out good power numbers. And that's kind of the point in a lot of races, is to save energy and save power, and to only use your efforts when you absolutely need to. And a lot of that has to do with positioning and also the way you race a race. With positioning, what you can do is really stay out of the wind, stay towards the front, but you don't want to be right on the front, sort of having to follow attacks or taking wind. So you want to be sticking well positioned and out of the wind. And then what you can do on climbs is, as the bunch goes uphill, if you're sort of positioned at the front, is you can just gradually slide back. And so you're producing less effort or less power for the duration of the hill before tagging onto the back just at the summit, and then using the descent or the easier part of the circuit or race to then move up through the bunch without using energy. It can be quite a risky strategy because you actually may miss out on something. You may miss out on a split on the climb, or a group that takes off on the climb. You may be too far back and not be well positioned for something important. So those are all risks that you're going to take if you race that way. But if that's your best chance at getting to the finish and then pulling off a good sprint and for a big result, then that's the best way for you to race. So it is possible to actually pull off really good results without putting out big numbers all day, and that's kind of the point of cycling sometimes, is to hide and do as little as possible and then make one big effort when it suits you most.